Imagine living on a remote farm, cut off from neighbors by long stretches of snow, with nothing but woods and fields surrounding your home. Now imagine that every creak in the attic and every shadow across the snow outside feels like it's being made by something, or someone watching you. That was the chilling reality for the Gruber family of Hinterkaifeck in 1922. For weeks, they were plagued by signs that something was wrong. They told friends, neighbors, and even their maid that their farmhouse wasn't safe, but no one believed them. Then, one night, all 6 of them were brutally murdered. This is one of the most disturbing unsolved crimes in history, the Hinterkaifeck Murders. And if you enjoy exploring chilling mysteries like this one, make sure to like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to Belmoze so you don't miss the rest of the series. The Gruber family consisted of Andreas, his wife Chesalia, their widowed daughter Victoria, Victoria's 2 children, and their new maid, Maria Baumgartner, who had only just arrived at the farm the day the killings began. On the surface, they were a normal Bavarian farming family, though rumors swirled in the village about dark secrets inside their home. But long before their brutal end, Andreas began noticing things that deeply unsettled him. One day in March 1922, after a fresh snowfall, Andreas spotted footprints leading from the woods directly to the farmhouse. At first he thought nothing of it. Perhaps a hunter or a lost traveler had wandered too close. But as he followed the tracks, he realized something chilling. The prints went only one way. They ended at his house. There were no tracks leaving. Whoever had made them had walked to the Gruber farm and then vanished. Andreas told his neighbors about this discovery, but they brushed it off. A misstep, an animal, or maybe he had just miscounted the tracks. Yet that wasn't all. Around the same time, the family began hearing noises from the attic. Footsteps, shifting boards, even the sound of someone pacing when the family was downstairs. Andreas searched, but he found nothing. No intruder, no sign of animals. It was as though someone was hiding in the farmhouse itself, just out of sight, waiting. The sense of dread grew stronger. A set of unfamiliar keys disappeared from the house. The family's newspaper, one they hadn't ordered, suddenly appeared on the doorstep. A lock looked tampered with. Victoria confided in friends that she felt unsafe, convinced that something wasn't right in the farmhouse. But the village was small, and their concerns were met with dismissive laughs. People assumed the Grubers were exaggerating or imagining things. The family's unease was so strong that their maid, who had worked for them before, quit months earlier, claiming the farm was haunted. She insisted she heard noises in the night, voices, and movement in the walls and attic. When she left, she told others she would never return. For weeks, the Grubers lived without household help. Only in late March did they hire a new maid, Maria Baumgartner, who came to the farm on the very day the murders happened. She was only there for a single day before the killer struck. Imagine her situation. She had just arrived, perhaps nervous but hopeful about starting her new job. She unpacked her things, settled into her room, and that night, she never woke up again. The lead up to the killings feels like something out of a horror story. Footprints in the snow that shouldn't have been there. Strange noises in the attic that no one could explain. Belongings moved, keys gone missing, and a maid so frightened she abandoned the family. And still, no one outside the farmhouse believed their fears. Andreas, known in the village as a harsh and stubborn man, wasn't easy to sympathize with. Many neighbors thought he exaggerated or even made up the stories to get attention. But what if he was telling the truth? What if, in those days before the murders, someone really was watching the Grubers? What if the killer was already inside their home? Think of the layout, a remote farm, miles from neighbors, surrounded by snow. In winter, sounds carry in the cold air, but in the Grubers' home, the noises came from above their heads. At night, the family slept in their rooms, hearing the faint scuffle of feet and creaking boards overhead. Every time Andreas checked, the attic appeared empty, yet the sounds returned the next night. If someone had been living in the walls or attic, the Grubers might never have known until it was too late. The missing keys added to the fear. Someone could lock or unlock doors without forcing their way in. The newspaper they hadn't subscribed to suggested that an outsider had been entering the home. These weren't just harmless pranks. They were signs of intrusion, hints of control, warnings that the family's safe space was already compromised. In hindsight, each clue feels like a piece of a sinister puzzle. Footprints that stop at the farmhouse, keys disappearing. Strange noises no one could explain. the maid who refused to stay because she was terrified of the place. All of it built a tension that finally exploded on the night of March 31st, 1922. By then, 6 people were living in the house: Andreas and his wife, their daughter Victoria, her 2 children, 7-year-old Chizalia and 2-year-old Josephine, the new maid, Maria. None of them knew that within hours they would be dead. None of them knew that the sounds in the attic, the missing keys, and the strange footprints were not warnings of something supernatural, but signs of a real intruder who was waiting for the right moment. The first part of this story shows how fear can grow slowly, day by day, until it consumes a family. It wasn't one single event that doomed the Grubers. It was a series of small, disturbing incidents that nobody took seriously. If they had been believed, if someone had investigated further, perhaps the murders could have been prevented. But instead, the warning signs piled up until it was too late. And what happened next was one of the most brutal crimes ever recorded in Germany. The Gruber family's fear became reality when an unseen killer stepped out of the shadows. This is only the beginning of the Hinterkaifeck murders, and in the next part, we'll explore how the crime itself unfolded in terrifying detail. If you want to hear the full story and dive deeper into one of history's most chilling unsolved mysteries, make sure to like this video, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Belmoze for the rest of this series. On the night of March 31st, 1922, the fears that had haunted the Gruber family finally took shape. What happened inside and around the farmhouse was an act of shocking violence, carried out with such precision and cruelty that investigators were left baffled. The killer, or perhaps more than one, struck with a pickaxe, a farm tool that was both easily available and devastatingly effective. One by one, each member of the family was bludgeoned to death. The strange thing is that there were no clear signs of a struggle. No overturned furniture, no scattered belongings, no frantic attempts to flee. It seemed as though the family was lured to their deaths, taken in sequence, with almost eerie calm. 4 of the victims, Andreas, his wife Chizalia, their daughter Victoria, and young Chizalia, Victoria's 7-year-old child, were found in the barn. Their bodies had been stacked together and covered with hay, as though the murderer had tried to conceal them or delay their discovery. The scene inside the farmhouse was no less horrifying. In one of the bedrooms, the new maid Maria Baumgartner was found dead in her bed. She had only been working there for a single day. In another room, the youngest member of the family, 2-year-old Joseph, was discovered in his crib, his small body lifeless. Both had been killed with the same brutal method. The choice to kill even the baby underscored the ruthless nature of the crime. Imagine the sequence of events. The killer first attacked in the barn, managing to overpower 4 family members without raising an alarm loud enough for the rest to react. Some theories suggest that the killer used tricks to lure the victims out one at a time. Perhaps they were drawn by noises in the barn, maybe even the sounds of animals being disturbed. One person would leave the safety of the house to check, only to be ambushed in the dark. When the first did not return, another followed, and then another, until 4 lay dead. Once the killer had dealt with those in the barn, they entered the house. Maria, who had been hired that very day, likely never knew what was happening outside. She may have been resting, exhausted from travel and settling in, when the attacker struck. As for Joseph, it seems he was killed last, the final act in a night of carnage that wiped out an entire household. What makes this case even stranger is that the crime was not discovered immediately. In fact, days passed before neighbors realized something was wrong. The Grubers were not the most social family, and their farm was isolated. It wasn't unusual for them to go days without being seen, but eventually, suspicions grew. Victoria had not attended church. The children did not appear at school. Mail piled up. Neighbors began to notice that while no one from the family was seen, smoke still rose from the chimney, and the farm animals were fed. When villagers finally decided to investigate, what they found was more chilling than anyone could have imagined. The barn doors were locked, but inside lay the bodies of Andreas, Chizalia, Victoria, and young Chizalia. Their skulls had been shattered by blows so forceful that some were nearly unrecognizable. Straw had been hastily thrown over them, as though the killer wanted to hide the horror, but didn't take care enough to bury them properly. Inside the house, the maid and the infant completed the death toll. The brutality of the murders shocked everyone. Yet at the same time, the strange orderliness of the scene raised disturbing questions. Why was there no evidence of resistance? Why didn't the victims scream loudly enough to alert others? Some accounts suggest that 7-year-old Chiselia survived long enough to pull out her own hair in terror. But even this detail adds more confusion. How could such violence occur without chaos spreading through the farmhouse? Even more unsettling was what the investigators realized after examining the farm. The killer had not fled immediately after committing the murders. For days after, someone stayed in the house, living among the corpses. Neighbors reported seeing smoke from the chimney and noted that the livestock had been fed. Meals were eaten, beds were slept in, and the dog tied up outside barked at unusual times. Whoever killed the family may have lingered for 2 or 3 days, calmly carrying on daily routines, as though nothing had happened. This detail disturbed investigators the most. It meant that the murderer was not in a rush, not panicked, and not afraid of being caught. Instead, they took their time, perhaps even enjoying the eerie silence of the farmhouse, as if the Gruber family had simply been replaced by this one intruder. That calmness suggests something about the killer's mindset. This wasn't just an act of rage or a crime of passion. It was methodical, deliberate, and chillingly controlled. The discovery of the bodies set the village of Kaifeck into shock. Rumors spread quickly. Some whispered that the murders were the result of a family feud. Others believed it was the work of robbers. But strangely, little was stolen. Money was found untouched in the house, along with jewelry and valuables. If theft wasn't the motive, then what was? The investigation revealed more oddities. The barn, where 4 victims had died, showed no signs of forced entry. The doors were intact. The killer may have already been inside, hiding, waiting for the right moment. This connected to the reports of strange noises in the attic and missing keys in the weeks before. If the murderer had been secretly living in the farmhouse before the crime, then the family may have been sharing their home with their killer all along. Another unsettling possibility is that the killer was someone the Grubers knew, someone they trusted enough to open the barn doors without suspicion. That might explain how they were lured out one by one without panic spreading. It might also explain the deliberate nature of the attack and the strange calm in its aftermath. The sheer brutality of the murders, combined with the eerie behavior that followed, left investigators grasping for answers. The farmhouse itself became a crime scene filled with contradictions. There was evidence of violence, but also evidence of control. There were signs of a hidden intruder, but also hints that the killer could have been someone close to the family. The scene revealed almost as many questions as it did horrors. As days passed, the villagers' fear grew. They no longer felt safe in their isolated homes. If such a crime could happen at Hinterkaifeck, then no one was beyond reach. Children were kept inside. Farmers began locking their barns at night. The idea that a murderer had walked calmly through their small community, possibly staying in the Gruber house for days afterward, cast a long shadow over the entire region. The second part of this story is not just about the murders themselves, but about the unsettling details that followed. A family wiped out in a single night, a killer who stayed behind to feed animals and light fires, and a crime scene that suggested planning and patience rather than panic. All of these elements turned the Hinterkaifeck murders from a tragedy into one of the most haunting mysteries of the 20th century. In the next part, the focus shifts to the investigation itself, how the authorities pieced together the events of that night and why, despite their efforts, the case only grew stranger. The most unsettling part of the Hinterkaifeck case is not only how the family died, but what happened afterward. Evidence strongly suggests that the killer, or perhaps more than one, remained at the farm for days after the murders. This detail takes the crime from horrifying to nightmarish, because it means the murderer did not simply kill and leave. Instead, they lingered among the dead, making themselves at home in a place that had just been turned into a slaughterhouse. Neighbors began to notice small details in the days following March 31st, details that seemed harmless on their own but chilling in hindsight. They saw smoke rising from the chimney of the Gruber farm, which suggested someone was inside, keeping the fire going. The family's livestock, including cows and chickens, appeared to have been fed, and fresh meals were said to have been prepared in the kitchen. These ordinary acts pointed to a disturbing possibility that the murderer was living on the farm after killing its inhabitants. Think about that for a moment. The barn still held the corpses of Andreas, Chiselia, Victoria, and young Chiselia. The house itself still held the bodies of Maria, the maid, and little Joseph, the 2-year-old child. Yet, while these victims lay dead, the killer cooked meals, slept in the farmhouse, and tended to animals as though they belonged there. It is as if the crime itself was not the end, but the beginning of something even darker, the farm becoming a kind of twisted sanctuary for the murderer. The idea of someone staying in the house after the murders makes the crime feel more personal. This was not a case of a bandit passing through, striking quickly, and leaving with stolen goods. Whoever did this seemed comfortable enough to spend days in the Gruber household, suggesting they either had nowhere else to go or felt a strange attachment to the place. In fact, this behavior has led some researchers to argue that the killer was someone who knew the family or even had a grudge against them. The neighbors became suspicious only when no one from the Gruber family appeared in the village. The family had a reputation for being somewhat isolated, but they were still part of the community. Victoria, for example, sang in the church choir, and her absence was quickly noted. When the family missed Sunday service without explanation, concern began to spread. Visitors to the farm noticed eerie signs. The dog tied up in the barn, barking relentlessly, the livestock restless, and the entire property unusually quiet, except for the faint crackle of the fire. Imagine walking past the farm during those days. The barn holds 4 lifeless bodies, yet smoke curls into the sky, signaling life inside. Animals are fed, their stalls clean, the dog is still barking. Someone is there, but it's not the Gruber family. That sight must have been terrifying once the truth came out, because the villagers realized that for days they had been looking at a house occupied, not by their neighbors, but by their killer. One theory is that the murderer remained there to avoid suspicion. If the farm looked abandoned right after the murders, people might have rushed to investigate. But by feeding the animals, tending to daily chores, and keeping the fire alive, the killer created the illusion that the Grubers were still around. It bought them precious time before anyone dared to come inside. Another idea is even more disturbing, that the killer stayed because they wanted to. Perhaps they enjoyed the silence, the control, or even the sense of victory over the family. The thought of someone sitting at the Gruber's kitchen table, eating their food, and sleeping under their roof while the bodies of his victims lay nearby is enough to send chills down anyone's spine. When the bodies were finally discovered on April 4th, several days after the murders, the gruesome truth was revealed. But by then, the killer or killers were long gone. Whoever had lived in that house with the dead had slipped away without leaving behind any clear trace. Investigators did find signs that supported the idea of someone staying there: blankets disturbed, food missing, and tools out of place. Yet none of this evidence pointed to a specific person. Instead, it only deepened the mystery and highlighted the killer's audacity. This part of the story has made the Hinterkaifeck case legendary in criminal history. Killings are horrifying enough, but the added layer of the murderer's extended presence gives the crime a grotesque intimacy. It suggests not just violence, but domination, not just cruelty, but control. It turns the farmhouse into something like a stage where the killer acted out a ritual of both destruction and occupation. For decades, this aspect of the case has haunted investigators and storytellers alike. In many true crime cases, killers try to flee as quickly as possible to avoid being caught. Here, the murderer did the opposite. They lingered, they settled in, they even maintained the household. That inversion of what we expect is what makes the Hinterkaifeck murders so unique and so deeply unsettling. People often ask what it must have felt like for the villagers once they realized this. The thought that for days the murderer was still right there, inside the house that everyone passed on their way to church or market, is enough to keep anyone awake at night. The crime wasn't just brutal, it was invasive. It blurred the line between safety and horror, turning an ordinary farmhouse into a place where death and daily life coexisted under the same roof. The Hinterkaifeck murders are already a chilling story because of the brutality of the killings, but the evidence that the killer stayed behind adds another layer. It speaks to a psychology that is hard to understand but impossible to forget. Whoever committed this crime wasn't just interested in murder. They wanted to control the space, to erase the family, and to take their place, if only for a short time. This behavior transforms the crime into something far more sinister, something that still feels like a wound on the quiet Bavarian countryside, even a century later. The investigation into the Hinterkaifeck murders was one of the largest in Bavaria at the time, yet it brought more confusion than clarity. From the beginning, the police faced a daunting challenge. The farm was isolated, surrounded by forests and fields, which meant the killer had plenty of time to escape without being noticed. There were no clear eyewitnesses, no confessions, and no direct evidence tying anyone to the crime. What the authorities did have were a series of rumors, suspicions, and strange details that seemed to lead nowhere. One of the first suspects was a neighbor who had a long-running feud with Andreas Gruber. The Grubers were not well liked in their community. Andreas, in particular, had a reputation for being harsh, stubborn, and difficult to get along with. He had clashed with villagers before, and his strained relationships made him an easy target for suspicion. It seemed logical to assume that someone who hated the family might have finally snapped, but when investigators looked closer, they found no real evidence linking the neighbor to the killings. The feud was unpleasant, but there was nothing to prove that it had escalated to mass murder. Attention also turned to Victoria's complicated personal life. Victoria Gruber was a widow, but she was not without suitors. One man who became a focus of the investigation was her former lover, who had once fathered her child. He had been involved in a bitter legal dispute with the Grubers over child support, and there was talk that tensions between him and Victoria had never fully resolved. The police questioned him at length, wondering if he might have acted out of anger or revenge. Yet again, the trail ran cold. He had an alibi, and although suspicion lingered, no hard proof tied him to the crime scene. The investigation widened to include drifters and travelers, because the farmhouse was near a forest path. Some theorized that a vagrant or a stranger had stumbled upon the property, killed the family, and taken shelter in the house for a few days. This idea seemed to fit with the evidence of someone staying in the house after the murders, but investigators struggled to find any wandering individual who matched the timeline. Random violence by a stranger was possible, but it did not explain the strange premonitions the family had before the murders, the footsteps in the snow, the noises in the attic, and the unease that had plagued them for weeks. Those details suggested something far more personal, someone who had been watching them and planning the attack. As the weeks went on, the list of suspects grew longer. Some villagers whispered about more scandalous theories. There were even rumors that Andreas Gruber's relationship with his daughter Victoria was not what it seemed. Dark suspicions of incest were raised, and some speculated that this twisted family dynamic may have driven someone in the household or close to it to commit the murders. These were disturbing claims, and although the police took note of them, there was no physical evidence to confirm such theories. One of the most frustrating aspects of the investigation was the lack of forensic tools available at the time. In 1922, modern techniques like DNA analysis, detailed blood pattern studies, or advanced crime scene reconstruction simply did not exist. Police relied mostly on witness testimony, rumors, and visible evidence. But the crime scene itself had already been compromised. In the days before the bodies were officially discovered, curious neighbors had walked through the farm, moving items and disturbing the environment. By the time investigators tried to piece everything together, the farm had already lost much of its forensic value. Still, the investigation pressed on. Dozens of people were interviewed. Police followed leads as far as they could. In some cases, they even revisited suspects years later, reopening files and re-questioning witnesses. Yet every time they seemed close to solving the case, they hit a dead end. No one ever confessed. No one was ever arrested. The Hinterkaifeck murders remained an open wound in the village, a story that people told in hushed voices for generations. What makes the unsolved nature of this case even more haunting is how many theories seem plausible but incomplete. If it was a neighbor, why was there no evidence? If it was a jealous lover, why did he leave the child he supposedly resented alive 4 days before the murders, only to strike later? If it was a drifter, why was there such clear evidence of someone familiar with the farm? And if it was someone close to the family, what motive could drive such a horrific act? Each theory answered some questions but created new ones, leaving investigators stuck in a circle of possibilities. Over time, the case became more than just a mystery, it became a legend. People speculated endlessly about the killer's identity, building stories that mixed fact with rumor. Some villagers believed the killer was someone who had gone mad and then disappeared into the woods, never to be seen again. Others believed the murderer might have been someone who stayed in the community, blending in with daily life, never raising suspicion again. The chilling possibility that the murderer lived out their life among the very people they had deceived only deepened the horror. The unsolved status of the Hinterkaifeck murders continues to fascinate historians, criminologists, and true crime enthusiasts today. Unlike cases where a killer is eventually caught and justice is served, Hinterkaifeck offers no such resolution. The farmhouse itself was eventually demolished, but the memory of what happened there has never been erased. The unanswered questions linger, and the fact that so many suspects were considered yet none arrested makes the case one of the most infamous in Germany as criminal history. This lack of closure is what makes the Hinterkaifeck murders feel alive even a century later. It is not just a story of a brutal crime, it is a story of suspicion, of failed investigations, of neighbors turning on one another, and of a community haunted by the knowledge that justice was never found. Every suspect seemed guilty, and yet every suspect also seemed innocent. The truth was always just out of reach. The fact that the killer could slaughter an entire family, remain in their home for days, and then vanish without a trace left a scar that no investigation could heal. Despite the hard work of the police, the case remains one of Germany's darkest unsolved mysteries, a riddle that still captures the imagination and chills the spine. The story of Hinterkaifeck did not end with the murders or the failed investigation. It lived on, whispered in villages, studied by criminologists, and feared by anyone who heard the tale. In many ways, the case became larger than life, transforming from a local tragedy into a symbol of mystery and fear. The details were so strange, so unsettling, that they refused to fade into history. Instead, they burned themselves into the folklore of Germany, where the farmstead and its name still evoke unease, even a century later. What sets Hinterkaifeck apart from other crimes is not just the brutality, but the atmosphere of dread that seemed to hang over the family even before their deaths. The footprints in the snow that led to the house but not away. The noises in the attic, the growing paranoia of the Grubers. These are not the details of an ordinary murder. They sound more like the build-up to a ghost story or a horror film, yet they were real. These signs suggested someone had been watching, waiting, and planning, whether it was a stalker, a neighbor, or even someone from within their own circle. The fact that such a threat lingered so close for so long adds a layer of terror that makes the case unique. The chilling aftermath that the killer stayed in the house for days only deepens the horror. It is not just the act of violence that horrifies, but the calm, deliberate routine that followed it. The smoke rising from the chimney, the animals being fed, the bread being eaten, all while the bodies lay lifeless, paint a picture of someone who was disturbingly comfortable with what they had done. This was not the behavior of a random madman passing through. It was the behavior of someone who felt entitled to the farm, to its food, its animals, and its space, even in the aftermath of mass murder. That unsettling detail has fueled generations of speculation. As the years passed, theories multiplied. Some believed it was an act of revenge by a wronged neighbor. Others pointed to the strained and scandalous dynamics within the family, suggesting that dark secrets had finally erupted in blood. Some went further, suggesting that the case was not entirely of this world, that the strangeness of the footprints, the mutilations, and the killer's unshakable calm hinted at something supernatural. These theories, while less likely, revealed just how disturbing the facts of the case are. When reality seems stranger than fiction, people look beyond the natural four explanations. The police investigation left more questions than answers. Over the years, the case was reopened multiple times, each attempt ending in the same frustration. Files were examined, suspects reviewed, even modern criminologists tried to reanalyze the details with new methods. Yet every attempt ended the same way, with uncertainty. The killer's identity remained hidden, locked away by time. Even today, with advances in forensic science, it is unlikely the truth will ever be uncovered. The farm itself was demolished in the 1920s, as if the community wanted to erase the scar. But the destruction of the building only added to the ghostly legend that surrounds it. What makes Hinterkaifeck endure is the combination of brutality and mystery. It was not only that 6 people were killed in such a remote and violent way, but that every detail seems to add a new layer of confusion. The killer left no clear motive. The investigation produced no confession. The community never found peace. It stands as a rare type of crime where almost every explanation makes sense, yet none can be proven. The case became part of German cultural memory, retold through stories, books, and even documentaries. But it is not remembered in the way a solved crime might be, where justice is found and the story ends. Instead, it remains like an open wound, a puzzle with missing pieces. Each new telling adds speculation, but the truth has been swallowed by time. This unresolved nature is what gives the story its haunting quality. It is a story without an ending, which makes it far more terrifying. For the people who lived nearby, the legacy of Hinterkaifeck was one of fear. Imagine being a villager at the time, knowing that 6 people were slaughtered just down the road, and that no one was ever punished. Imagine watching the police fail year after year and wondering if the killer might still be among you. Blending in, smiling in the market, nodding politely at church, the knowledge that the murderer may have walked freely among them made the crime feel alive long after the bodies were buried. That fear lingered for generations, carried down through family stories and whispered warnings. Even now, more than a century later, the Hinterkaifeck murders are studied not just as a true crime case, but as a symbol of how violence and mystery can outlast time itself. The small farm, destroyed and gone, has become a place of myth. The story has no neat resolution, and that is what keeps it alive. It forces us to confront the possibility that some questions will never be answered, some crimes will never be solved, and some shadows will always remain just beyond reach. The bizarre details, the footprints, the attic noises, the mutilations, the killer feeding animals as if nothing had happened make Hinterkaifeck one of the most disturbing mysteries of the 20th century. It has everything a horror tale could want: isolation, premonitions, brutality, and a vanishing culprit. Yet it is not fiction, it is history, and that is what makes it so chilling. The legacy of Hinterkaifeck is more than just a true crime case. It is a reminder of how fragile safety can be, how quickly an ordinary family can become the subject of legend, and how evil can thrive in silence when answers remain hidden. The Gruber family's farm may have been torn down, but the memory of their fate continues to cast a shadow, not just in Bavaria, but across the world of unsolved mysteries. And if this story has unsettled you as much as it has countless others, then you'll understand why Hinterkaifeck continues to live on in folklore and nightmares alike. For more dark histories and unsettling mysteries, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Belmoze.